Jesse was the first to run. He fled from the corner of the alley, from the shadow of the damp brick wall. Caleb's words about being in love with him sent Jesse's mind into a tailspin, a chaotic blur of disbelief and panic. He must have woken up wrong this morning, or maybe Caleb had been replaced by an identical stranger. Love him? That was impossible. If anyone in the world held a special place of contempt for Jesse, Caleb would be at the top of the list. At Northwood High, Jesse was a master of his own particular crafts. Smoking behind the gym, skipping fourth period for beer runs, fighting in the parking lot. He was a lost cause in the eyes of every parent and a hopeless case to every teacher. He had been coasting through life on the principle of just getting by, a lifestyle that was dull but liberating. That all changed his senior year when he was placed in the same homeroom as Caleb. His comfortable apathy began to fray. One afternoon, while vaulting the chain-link fence behind the bleachers to make a run to the arcade downtown, he misjudged the landing. He hadn't expected someone to be standing on the other side. He crashed directly into a solid frame, sending them both tumbling to the ground. When his vision cleared and he saw who it was, the blade of grass he'd been chewing dropped from his lips. He let out a low whistle, asking if the golden boy skipped class too. While Jesse was the archetype of a slacker, Caleb was the standard-bearer for the entire student body. Jesse had heard his name long before they shared a classroom, a constant drone of accolades that followed Caleb like a shadow. Academic decathlon wins, state science fair championships, a perfect GPA. Praise and glory were permanently affixed to his name. Jesse had assumed their worlds would never intersect. He had been wrong. Caleb seemed determined to make Jesse his personal project. Caleb's response to his question was a terse command to go back inside. Jesse flexed one arm, rubbing the elbow he'd landed on, a smirk still plastered on his face. He remarked that he never knew honor students could be so rude. The comment visibly darkened Caleb's expression. Caleb repeated himself, his voice colder this time, telling him to get back to class. Jesse's smile finally faded. He leaned against a tree trunk, his eyes narrowing as he tried to figure out what had gotten into the school's prodigy. He challenged Caleb, asking what he would do if Jesse refused. Caleb just watched him with an unreadable, intense stare. In the end, Jesse's insistence on leaving was met with Caleb's insistence on stopping him. The result was a scuffle that landed them both in the dean's office. Caleb was seated on the worn leather sofa. Jesse was standing beside it. Dean Holloway, a man whose remaining hair clung to the sides of his head like stubborn weeds, took a long sip from a steaming mug. He told Jesse that he usually turned a blind eye to his antics, but that he wouldn't tolerate him dragging down other students. Caleb frowned, starting to explain that it was his fault, but the dean interrupted him, refilling Caleb's cup of water. He advised Caleb that senior year was critical and offered to move him to another class, away from what he called unsavory influences like Jesse. Caleb suddenly stood up. He stated firmly that the dean should know the facts before jumping to conclusions. Dean Holloway's hand, holding his coffee mug, froze midway to his lips. His face soured. His gaze shifted to Jesse, the source of the disruption. The dean's frustration, thwarted by Caleb, now found its intended target. He started yelling, his voice rising in pitch as he ordered Jesse to go stand outside his classroom door. Jesse just shrugged, stretched lazily, and sauntered out of the office with a sense of relief. Whether he actually stood there or not was entirely up to him. He heard quiet, determined footsteps behind him but ignored them. The owner of those footsteps, however, refused to be ignored. Caleb's voice cut through the hallway's quiet hum, pointing out that Jesse was heading away from their classroom and asking where he was going. At the turn in the corridor, Jesse had hopped onto the railing, planning to slide down. A hand shot out and grabbed the back of his hoodie, yanking him to a halt. He took a deep, frustrated breath. He told Caleb he was heading to the arcade that Caleb had so rudely interrupted his trip to. He had no intention of wasting such a fine afternoon in a sterile hallway. He tried to tug his hoodie free, but the grip was unyielding. Caleb's voice came from behind him, calm but absolute. He told Jesse to come back to class with him. The smirk that was Jesse's default expression finally vanished, his patience worn thin. He turned, asking Caleb if he'd run out of homework or if the lectures weren't stimulating enough to keep him from harassing Jesse. In one fluid motion, Jesse grabbed the arm holding him, using Caleb's own momentum to pull him forward and off balance. He twisted, sweeping Caleb's legs out from under him. The motion ended with Caleb on his back at the very top of the staircase. Jesse's knee pressed firmly into his stomach. Jesse looked down at him, his eyes cold. The slightest movement from Caleb would send him tumbling down the entire flight of stairs. Their eyes met, and Jesse's voice was a low growl. He told him to stay away. But Caleb didn't stay away. If anything, he became a more persistent presence in Jesse's life. He eventually petitioned their homeroom teacher to have his seat moved next to Jesse's. The teacher was initially against it, but Caleb, with his spotless record and persuasive arguments, somehow convinced her. For the first time in his high school career, Jesse pleaded with a teacher. He failed. In her office, the homeroom teacher, Ms. Albright, adjusted her glasses. She advised him not to provoke Caleb, reminding Jesse that they were from different worlds. Jesse had replied with a wry smile. He'd suggested that maybe she should move the saint to another pew, because his little corner of hell wasn't built for someone like Caleb. He warned that if a fire started, the golden boy might get burned. Ms. Albright's expression had flickered through a range of emotions before settling on disappointment. She wondered aloud what had happened to make him this way. Jesse had simply thought to himself that she had a lot to do with it. Leaving the office, his mood was foul. Naturally, that was the moment Caleb chose to approach him, calling his name. Jesse ignored him, quickening his pace. But Caleb was relentless, jogging to catch up. Jesse finally snapped, whirling around and grabbing Caleb by the collar of his shirt. He asked him, his voice tight with fury, if he could just get lost. After that, Jesse took a few days off, calling the school to say he was so sick he was knocking on death's door. The attendance office knew it was nonsense, but they were likely glad for the break from him and approved the absence without question. He thought he'd finally found some peace. He was wrong. The fifth time the doorbell rang, Jesse finally dragged himself out of bed. He yanked the door open and leaned against the frame. He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm, if even hiding at home wasn't enough to get Caleb to leave him alone. Caleb just stood there, his lips pressed into a thin line. A faint blush colored his cheeks. Jesse wondered if the kid had run all the way to his house. Why else would he be flushed? After a moment of silence, Caleb spoke. He noted that the weather was getting colder and that Jesse should wear a shirt. Jesse, who slept without one, felt a sardonic smile touch his lips. He asked if Caleb had really come all this way just to give him wardrobe advice. Caleb's brow furrowed. He wanted to know why Jesse wasn't at school. Jesse's retort was sharp. He asked if Caleb was his brother, a relative, or his teacher. As he moved to slam the door, he demanded to know by what authority Caleb felt he could manage his life. The door shut with a definitive crack. He hadn't expected Caleb to still be there. Later, when Jesse went out to throw away a pizza box, he saw him standing by the curb. Caleb wore only a thin jacket, and his lips were tinged with blue from the cold. He saw Jesse and strode toward him, repeating his question. Why wasn't he in school? Jesse was speechless for a moment. It was possible the model student had studied so hard his brain had short-circuited. How could one person be so single-minded? He gave Caleb a two-word answer. He didn't want to be. He added that whether it was because of him or not, he still wanted Caleb to leave him alone. Caleb tried to hand him a folder, explaining that he'd brought Jesse's assignments and notes. Jesse tossed his trash into the bin and cut him off, his tone menacing. He asked Caleb if he wanted to end up in the trash too. He told him to stay away, that people who got close to him became unlucky, and that people who stayed away lived better lives. He assumed that would be the end of it, that their paths would finally diverge. But he had underestimated Caleb's tenacity. Caleb tried to use the rulebook of a good student to rein him in, and Jesse responded with all the defiance of a seasoned delinquent. The teachers at school began to complain even more loudly that Jesse was corrupting their star pupil. Their fears were seemingly confirmed when, on one occasion, Caleb actually skipped class with him, though it was only because Jesse had tricked him into it. Caleb's already stoic expression became glacial that day, while Jesse was in the best mood he'd been in for weeks. He had warned Caleb that if he kept pushing, Jesse couldn't guarantee he wouldn't do something worse. When they returned, the school didn't punish Caleb, but he punished himself, standing for a week straight during every class period as a form of self-imposed detention. Jesse watched him from his slumped position in his own chair, amused. He couldn't understand why someone would go out of their way to make themselves miserable. He finally asked Caleb if they could call a truce. He questioned why Caleb was so fixated on him, wondering if he'd ever done anything to offend him. Before Caleb could answer, a piece of chalk hit Jesse square in the head, thrown by Ms. Albright, who told him that if he didn't want to learn, he shouldn't distract those who did. Jesse came to realize that Caleb approached everything with a scholar's intense focus. He even applied that same focus to discovering Jesse's secret. He liked men. One evening, leaving a bar downtown, Jesse had his arm slung over another guy's shoulder, his head bent close as they talked. Through the neon haze, he thought he saw a familiar figure. He looked up. Standing not far away was Caleb, dressed in his usual simple white shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to Jesse's own disheveled appearance. When their eyes met, Jesse saw a storm of emotions in Caleb's gaze: shock, confusion. He held the look for only a second before turning away. After putting the guy in a cab, Jesse headed for a side street, taking a route through the darker, less traveled parts of the neighborhood. He knew Caleb would follow. Part of him expected it. Part of him was surprised by it. A faint smile played on his lips. At a sharp corner, he acted, yanking Caleb into a narrow alley and slamming him against a brick wall. He pressed his forearm against Caleb's throat. He remarked coolly that he never knew the school's top student had a penchant for stalking. Caleb's eyes darted away. He denied it. Jesse leaned in closer. He said that now that Caleb had seen, he could finally stay away. That place was the city's largest gay bar, a place no one with conventional tastes would ever be. Caleb's voice was as cool as his appearance when he asked who the other person was. Jesse paused, surprised that Caleb was more concerned with the man he was with than the fact that Jesse liked men at all. An unusual flicker of interest sparked within him. He lowered his arm slightly, his hand tracing the long line of Caleb's neck. He whispered by Caleb's ear, his voice a low purr. He warned him that caring so much might make Jesse obsessed with him. He brought a knee up, forcing Caleb's legs apart. Or, he mused, perhaps Caleb was the one trying to seduce him. A car horn blared from the main street, drowning out his last word. But he knew Caleb had seen the shape of it on his lips. As expected, Caleb's handsome face darkened, his expression turning frigid. Anyone would be repulsed by such a crude advance, especially someone as seemingly pristine as Caleb. For him, this was probably the first time in his life he had ever been humiliated in such a way. But Jesse didn't mind being cruder if it meant driving him away for good. He tilted his head, his other hand slipping under the hem of Caleb's shirt. The skin beneath his fingers was exactly as he'd imagined. Smooth and soft. A shiver ran through him. For someone who looked so cold, Caleb's body temperature was surprisingly high, a heat that seemed to burn Jesse's fingertips. At that moment, Caleb's eyes were locked on his. Those brown irises, usually so distant, now churned with 1,000 emotions. Anger, restraint, and something else that looked disturbingly like desire. To be honest, Jesse had felt something for Caleb from the moment he first saw him. But then Ms. Albright's words echoed in his mind. "He's not your kind, Jesse." He pulled his hands away, stepping back and patting Caleb's shoulder dismissively. He told him again not to mess with him. The instant he turned to leave, a powerful force yanked him backward. His spine slammed against the brick wall, a dull, delayed pain spreading through his back. He was hauled forward by his collar. He knew he'd said some vile things, so he let his hands fall to his sides in a silent apology. The next second, a hand tangled in his hair, cupping the back of his head, and a mouth crashed down on his. Before he could process it, the other man had already taken advantage of his shock. The kiss was clumsy and bruising, more of a violent seizure than an act of affection, a raw release of pent-up frustration. The metallic taste of blood slowly bloomed on his tongue. His brain, starved of oxygen, seemed to shut down for a moment. By the time he came to his senses, a school jacket had been thrown over his head. Caleb's voice, low and rough, came through the fabric. He said that Jesse had started this. When Jesse finally ripped the jacket off, the alley was empty. Only the night wind was left to brush against his slightly swollen lips. He didn't quite remember how he got home or how he ended up in bed. He stared at the ceiling, his fingertips pressing against his tender mouth. His mind was a blank slate. He closed his eyes, but all he could see was Caleb's face, cold enough to freeze water. He grabbed the pillow from under his head and punched it until it was flat, then lay back down. It didn't help. He got up and cleaned his entire room, then did 20 sets of push-ups, a half-hour plank, 10 minutes of crunches, and lifted weights until his arms burned. He ended by staring at a punching bag for 30 minutes. At 3 in the morning, he took a cold shower. Lying in bed, sleep still wouldn't come. The next day, for the first time ever, he wasn't late. He was the first one in the classroom. He propped his head on his hand, his arm resting on the desk, and stared at the door, idly twirling a long, thin pen between his fingers. It was Caleb's. Students slowly trickled in for morning study hall. The first bell rang, and the seat beside him remained empty. Annoyed, he kicked the chair in front of him. The junior sitting there, who had been napping, jumped, then turned around with a scowl. Seeing it was Jesse, his expression immediately shifted to a grin. He asked what was up. Jesse told him to take good notes for every class until he got back. The junior seemed surprised, asking if Jesse was suddenly taking charge of his education. Jesse clarified that the notes weren't for him. They were for Caleb. The junior asked where he was going. Jesse hesitated for a moment, then kicked his chair again and told him not to ask stupid questions. Just as he was about to skip, he was called to Ms. Albright's office. She was the only one there. He stood in front of her desk, his face a mask of indifference. She didn't look up from her papers. She asked him if he was in love with Caleb. A cold laugh escaped him. He asked if she was blind. She finally looked up, a smile on her face that made his skin crawl. She said she was his mother and his teacher, and she knew him. Jesse retorted that overthinking things could lead to mental illness. Helen's smile only widened. He turned and walked out. The air in that room with her felt toxic. He found Caleb's address from the school registry. Standing outside the apartment door, he almost turned back. He felt like an idiot. Why should he care if the golden boy came to school or not? Couldn't possibly be because of him. But just as he was about to leave, the door opened. The hallway light flickered on. A middle-aged woman carrying a cloth bag looked at him, startled. She asked who he was. He was about to say he had the wrong place and make a quick escape, but she noticed the school insignia on his jacket, and her expression softened into a warm smile. She asked if he was one of Caleb's friends and insisted he come inside. Before he could form a polite refusal, she had pulled him into the small, tidy apartment and handed him a new pair of slippers. She told him to make himself at home, pointing out where the fruit, drinks, and snacks were, and which room was Caleb's. He mumbled his thanks, his eyes following her gestures as he took in the space. His brain, running on fumes, supplied a thoughtless response. He said Caleb's lips were soft. The words, once spoken, hung in the air, and his body froze. What the hell was he saying? The woman turned back to him, her smile gentle but tinged with confusion. What was soft? The sofa, he blurted out. The sofa was soft. He laughed awkwardly, feeling his face flush. The woman didn't press the issue, simply picking her bag back up. She said she was stepping out for a bit and would be back soon. He nodded obediently, telling her to take care. His gaze was fixed on the closed door to Caleb's bedroom, terrified of it making a sound. He calculated that the woman was probably out of the building by now. He tiptoed to the entryway, quietly opened the shoe cabinet, and retrieved his shoes, trying not to make a single noise. His plan was to leave and pretend he'd never been there. He put his hand on the doorknob, pressed down gently, and pushed. It didn't budge. He then noticed the sound he'd heard earlier, the unmistakable click of a deadbolt. The woman had a habit of locking the door from the outside. One locked room, two people who had kissed. He remembered the brief touch, the feel of a lean, strong waist, of thin, soft lips. He wondered if pressing down on them would be harder than the sofa he was sitting on. He was losing his mind. He looked out the sixth-floor window. As much as he was spiraling, he wasn't ready to die. Climbing out was not an option. He dropped his head into his hands and rubbed his scalp furiously. A tiny devil with a pitchfork appeared in his mind, asking him what he was afraid of. It wasn't a monster in there, just someone he'd kissed. It wasn't like they'd slept together. An angel with glowing wings appeared on his other side, reminding him that he came here because he wanted to take responsibility. It told him to admit it, that he was into guys like Caleb. The little devil grinned, saying that times had changed. The angel smiled gently, adding that if he liked him, he should go for it. Such a perfect opportunity had fallen into his lap. If he couldn't seize it, it only proved one thing: that he was a coward. A coward? Jesse scoffed internally. He stood up and strode toward Caleb's bedroom. The moment he pushed the door open, he lost his footing and stumbled forward into the room. He threw his hands out instinctively to break his fall, but they landed on a familiar, narrow waist. He crashed into a solid body. A low, raspy voice sounded from above him. It was his name. Jesse froze. He finally understood what writers meant when they described a mind going completely blank. He couldn't think, couldn't speak. His hands were pinned. A hand clamped around his neck, forcing his chin up. The Caleb before him now was nothing like the one he knew. He had always thought of him as a pale, weak bookworm. But the seemingly slender frame was deceptively strong. Caleb looked down at him and asked him what he was doing there. Jesse, in a moment of déjà vu, asked why Caleb wasn't at school. The words sounded eerily familiar. Caleb's grip tightened slightly, holding him down as he leaned closer. He was so near Jesse could see his own reflection in Caleb's brown eyes and feel the ghost of his breath on his skin. Caleb repeated Jesse's own words back to him, asking if he was his teacher. Or, he added with a cold smirk, his brother. The tables had well and truly turned. Jesse forced himself to be patient. As a classmate, he said he was naturally concerned. Caleb's eyes darkened, becoming even colder than usual. If before he was like a disturbed cat, now he was like a lion annoyed by unruly prey. He released Jesse, but in the next instant, Jesse was pulled forward and thrown onto the soft bed. The clean, crisp scent of pine enveloped him. He demanded to know what was wrong with Caleb. Just as he tried to get up, Caleb swung a leg over him, straddling his hips and pinning him back down. He held Jesse's hands above his head against the pillow, looming over him. His lips parted and he spoke 2 words. "Classmate?" He asked if Jesse really couldn't see that he never wanted to be just his classmate. Something exploded in Jesse's mind. He didn't snap out of it until Caleb's other hand started to hook under his shirt. Jesse grabbed Caleb's wrist but couldn't break his grip. He cursed himself for last night's sleepless workout. He had no strength left to fight this kid off. He asked Caleb if he'd been drinking. Caleb didn't answer, a man of action. A shiver ran down Jesse's spine. He cursed, asking what the hell he was gnawing on. His body, unaccustomed to such intimate contact, began to heat up. His long-dormant sense of shame suddenly roared to life. Realizing he couldn't win with strength, he tried to appeal to Caleb's conscience. He called him by his full name, Mr. Honor Student, and asked him to think about whether what he was doing was worthy of his mountain of accolades. Caleb simply pulled off his own white cotton shirt in one smooth motion. His body was lean and toned, his skin pale. The lines of his abdomen disappeared into the waistband of his pants. He looked down at Jesse, his eyes slightly red, his expression serious. He said that if Jesse said the word no just once, he would let him go. Damn it. He was handsome, had a great body, and was the stoic, unattainable type. Jesse was used to seeing him focused on his studies. This contrast was utterly captivating. He muttered under his breath, asking why the hell he was taking his clothes off while they were talking. A corner of Caleb's mouth turned up. He answered, "Good." Then his hand closed around Jesse's ankle. Wait, he protested. But Caleb couldn't wait another second. He didn't listen to another word, burying his head and getting to work. Jesse glanced down and took a sharp breath. "Caleb," he said, "this could kill someone." He wasn't joking. When he woke again, the sky outside was dark. The occasional car passed by below. His waist ached, his legs ached, his ass ached. But he felt clean, not sticky. The clothes he was wearing seemed to be Caleb's. Caleb opened the door and came in, though he wouldn't meet Jesse's eyes. He silently handed him a glass of water. A little while ago he was asking if it hurt while calling him baby, and now he was playing shy? Jesse asked him where he'd learned all that. The prodigy's pale face flushed a deeper red. He mumbled that dinner was ready, that his mom had cooked. Jesse practically crawled out of bed, forcing his battered body to the dining table. Caleb's mother pulled off her apron, rubbing her hands together. She greeted him warmly, telling him to sit and try the food. He smiled back, his eyes fixed on the hard wooden chair as if it were a mortal enemy. Just then, Caleb brought over a soft cushion and placed it on the chair for him. Jesse breathed a silent sigh of relief. A table laden with steaming dishes, the sound of a woman's cheerful laughter, and a bowl that was constantly being piled high with food. His mom explained that because of Caleb's serious face, he'd never had any friends over. She was so happy she even opened a can of beer for herself. Caleb placed a hand over hers, chiding her gently. She just pouted, saying she was happy. She went on about how Caleb had always been good at everything except making friends. She turned to Jesse, telling him he was the very first one to visit. Jesse caught a glimpse of Caleb's reddening ear tips out of the corner of his eye and had to suppress a laugh. She said she had spent all day at the market to buy groceries for this meal and asked how it was. He gave her a thumbs up, telling her it was amazing. She beamed, saying he was so sweet she should adopt him. He played along, calling her godmom. Under the table, Caleb tugged at his sleeve and whispered that his mom was a lightweight and was already drunk. She overheard, protesting that she was not. After one can, she was holding her chopsticks backward. Eventually, Jesse and Caleb helped her to her room. When they came out, Jesse put on his school jacket, ready to head home. Caleb offered to walk him. At the door, Jesse pushed him back, saying he was a grown man and could get home by himself. But Caleb's stubborn streak resurfaced. He blocked the door, refusing to move, his other hand clamped around Jesse's wrist. Jesse sighed, closed his eyes, and steeled himself. He reached up, pulled Caleb's head down, and kissed him. Caleb was stunned for only a moment before his arms wrapped around Jesse's waist, deepening the kiss. It was fierce and possessive, without a trace of gentleness. When they broke apart, Caleb brushed his thumb over Jesse's lips. He asked again about the guy from the bar. Jesse explained that it was just a friend of a friend, helping him look cool. Caleb's expression relaxed slightly. "My turn to ask," Jesse said. "Are you coming to school tomorrow?" "Yes." "And have you taken care of that?" "Yes." "See you tomorrow," Caleb said. Jesse nodded. "See you tomorrow." The moment he put his key in the lock of his own front door, he knew it had been opened. He casually unlocked it and stepped inside. The lights were on. On the leather sofa in the living room sat a familiar, aging figure. Jesse leaned against the entryway cabinet with a cold smirk. He asked what wind had blown him here. Helen, who was standing near the old man, walked toward him. She was dressed not in her usual simple teacher's attire, but in clothes that screamed luxury. The non-prescription glasses she wore at school were gone. She told Jesse she was giving him a chance. A chance for what? He feigned innocence. He might skip a class now and then, but wasn't that what she wanted? There was no need for a home visit. Helen threw a stack of photos at him. They scattered across the floor. He only needed to glance at one to feel his blood run cold. It was a picture of him and Caleb, locked in an embrace in the school stairwell, kissing. The angle was clandestine. He asked her if she'd had him followed. Helen sneered. She knew it. He was just as abnormal as his father. She said that after all these years, his ability to be disgusting had only grown. Seeing her face darken, Jesse continued to smile. He recounted her greatest hits, drugging his father to get into his bed, and now hiring people to stalk her own son. He remarked that her life was becoming a real crime story. A sharp sting bloomed on his cheek. Her long, pointed nails scraped his skin. As his teacher, she said, she was punishing him for his insolence. As his mother, she was punishing him for being a disgrace. He thanked her sarcastically, saying he thought for a moment she was going to teach him how to climb into a man's bed, or how to be a homewrecker. Back then, Helen had used every trick in the book to get his father and become Mrs. Archer. She claimed his father liked men and she was saving him, preventing him from making a mistake. In the same way, she now had to pull Jessie back from the brink. Jessie pointed out that she conveniently forgot to mention the years of depression his father suffered. Helen raised her hand again, but he caught her wrist. He told her that even if his father had liked women, he would never have liked a manipulative, controlling person with her kind of gutter-level tactics. And if not for him, where would she be? He warned her not to try and guilt-trip him. She may have given birth to him, but she had never raised him. Enough. The man on the sofa finally spoke, his voice strong and clear. He told Jessie that he would marry a woman, and if he didn't want anything to happen to the boy named Caleb, he would comply. After they left, Jessie destroyed everything in the room he could get his hands on. Finally, he collapsed amidst the wreckage. People are greedy creatures. At first, he had promised himself he would just watch Caleb from a distance, no contact, no complications. But under Caleb's intense gaze, that promise had crumbled. He knew his grandfather didn't make idle threats. Helen's success was largely due to the old man's tacit approval. His father had despised Helen, and he hadn't liked Jessie either. When he was 4, his father had stroked his head and told him it wasn't his fault, that he just couldn't face him. He promised that in the next life he would love him properly. The next afternoon, news came that his father had killed himself. A 4-year-old couldn't process that kind of information. All he knew was to pull up a chair, stack books on it, and peer through the glass at the man lying inside, surrounded by machines he'd never seen before. Helen had told him then not to end up like his father. He hadn't been saved. His phone screen lit up, a piercing glare in the dark room, pulling him from his memories. It was a message from Helen. He glanced at it once before hurling the phone against the wall. But the words were already burned into his mind. Do you know why your father killed himself? He caused the death of the man he loved. I tried to warn him. I told him to just stay by my side. But he wouldn't listen. After that man died, he was filled with regret. But your grandfather learned his lesson from the pain of losing a son. Don't think about dying, dear boy. You wouldn't want Caleb to die, would you? You live so he can live. You leave him so he can live well. The next morning, dressed in jeans and a white t-shirt, Jessie dragged a blue suitcase through the airport, a pair of black-framed glasses on his face. He watched the sky through the terminal window until the boarding call for his flight was announced. He rubbed the back of his neck, his fingers unconsciously drifting to his collarbone. Caleb had kissed him there. On the plane, the clear sky began to drizzle. Before takeoff, he made a call. It was answered quickly. He leaned back in his seat and told his grandfather not to forget what he'd promised. Helen's light laugh came through the line. She assured him they wouldn't. She knew how crazy he could be. School, work, marriage, continuing the family line. As long as he was obedient, they would pretend nothing had ever happened. Nothing would happen to Caleb. Just as he was about to hang up, he heard a voice on the other end that he knew all too well. Hello? His hand froze. He heard the faint clatter of a phone being placed on a desk. Helen hadn't hung up. She told someone to come in. He heard Caleb's voice, farther away at first, then closer, telling Ms. Albright that his desk mate hadn't come in today. The sound, filtered through the phone, felt unreal. She replied that his absence wasn't exactly unusual. There was a short silence. Jesse could picture the expression on Caleb's face. But he promised we'd see each other today. Jesse took a deep breath, a tight knot forming in his chest that made it hard to breathe. A flight attendant noticed his distress and asked if he was okay. Helen's voice cut in again, explaining that Jesse had a family emergency, that it looked like he was transferring abroad. This morning's flight. Sir, the flight attendant urged, the plane is about to take off. Please turn off your phone or switch to airplane mode. She mentioned that she thought the two of them were close and asked if Jesse hadn't told him. Another brief silence. Then Caleb's cool voice sounded again. He and Jesse were just classmates. Sir, the plane is taking off now. He switched off the phone. Thank you, he said. The flight attendant gave a relieved smile and moved down the aisle. He closed his eyes, exhausted. Just classmates? But he hadn't wanted to be just classmates either. High above the clouds, he repeated a silent plea over and over. Wait for me, Caleb. Wait until I'm strong enough to come back to you. Then mountains and seas won't be able to keep us apart. 6 years later, the moment his feet touched the soil of his home country, he felt truly alive. For 6 years, he had been a walking ghost, sustained by a single simple thought. The Archer family's assistant was waiting for him at arrivals. He drove, Jesse sat in the back. He informed Jesse that Mr. Archer had arranged a banquet for him at 8 that evening and expected him to be there on time. Jesse agreed. The assistant added that he would wait for him until 8. It was a polite way of saying he was being watched. Whether at home or abroad, the feeling of being monitored was a constant presence, a sharp reminder that he had to endure to wait. To strike a snake, you had to hit it 7 inches below the head. At the banquet, Helen approached him. The thick layer of foundation on her face couldn't hide the wrinkles around her eyes. She told him he was smarter than his father. When he didn't respond, she continued, unbothered. His father, she mused, had foolishly dreamed of running away with his lover and ended up with nothing. But Jesse had chosen to let go, to obey. She admitted she was surprised he had remained unattached for 6 years. Was Caleb really that special to him? Jesse's grip on his wine glass tightened, but his expression remained placid. He advised her that worrying too much aged a person and that she should take better care of herself instead of meddling in things that didn't concern her. Helen's mask of composure cracked for a second. She prided herself on her appearance. But she quickly recovered, her smile returning, as sickening as ever. She pointed out a young woman across the room, telling Jesse that his grandfather had arranged for her to be his fiancée. With that parting shot, she turned and walked away on her skyscraper heels, triumphant. He took a sip of wine. It was good wine. But the only thing that could ever truly intoxicate him wasn't this. It was a person. If they met again, he wondered, how would he even begin to apologize? Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome the man of the hour. He was pushed toward the center of the hall. Another young person was nudged forward from the other side. His grandfather sat on the main chair, a throne of sorts. He announced that this was the eldest daughter of the Cheen family, his betrothed since childhood. Jesse cut him off. He stated that the old man should know by now that he didn't like women. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the person standing next to him give him a subtle thumbs up. Helen, seated to the side, shot to her feet. She hissed his name, asking if he was insane. He just smiled. He'd always been a little insane. He posed a question to his grandfather. Did he want a stake in Astra, or did he want a descendant he might never live to see? The old man, well into his years, understood the implication immediately. He rose, sputtering with rage. Jesse calmly advised him to mind his health, as anger was bad for the heart. Helen stepped forward, adopting the posture of a concerned elder. She warned Jesse in a low voice to be mindful of the occasion. She didn't care if he was crazy, but he needed to think about that other person, still trying to threaten him, as if he'd spent the last 6 years just eating and sleeping. He ignored her and looked back at the main seat. The old man coughed, and his secretary immediately rushed to his side. The grandfather stared at Jesse, his eyes filled with a familiar, probing greed. He asked what Jesse had meant about Astra. Jesse knew the scales in the old man's mind had tipped. In his life, the only things he could never resist were beautiful women, money, and power. His desires were bottomless. Self-interest always came first. Jesse stated calmly that he was Astra's largest shareholder. If the old man agreed to his terms, he could have a piece of the pie. Astra was a dark horse in the tech world. Shortly after its IPO, it had grown at an explosive rate, its innovative technology and aggressive market expansion making it an industry titan. Companies vied for partnership. Jesse had poured his heart and soul, countless sleepless nights, into building it. Astra was a prize, and now a shortcut to it was being offered to his grandfather. How could he refuse? To gain his freedom, Jesse needed the power to take it. Only the strong had a say. You? Astra's shareholder? Helen, of course, didn't believe it. She had so many people watching him, but her focus was narrow and petty. She only cared about who he was contacting, whether he was starting a new relationship. He replied that talk was cheap. He clapped his hands. The secretary who had been attending to his grandfather immediately stopped, retrieved a briefcase, and walked to Jesse's side. Jesse saw the shock in both his grandfather's and Helen's eyes. The secretary laid out the documents one by one. His grandfather's hand trembled as he pointed at the secretary, managing only to stammer out a single word. You. The secretary was the younger sister of his father's deceased lover. The old man, blinded by beauty, had never bothered to check her background, a loophole Jesse had happily exploited. His terms were simple. Let him leave the Archer family. In return, he had a gift. He would give him a grandson. His words were a bombshell. The old man stumbled down from the platform, asking what he had said. Helen, for the first time, lost her look of smug victory. It was replaced by pure terror. Jesse looked at her. He mentioned that the housekeeper she had forced out years ago had been pregnant at the time. He didn't need to elaborate. Helen's already pale face went white. She stammered, trying to explain, but the old man slapped her across the face. Jesse could guess Helen's motives. It was all about the inheritance. The old man had had a brief affair with the housekeeper, but Helen, in all her calculations, had never imagined the woman could get pregnant. What followed would be a messy internal war. It was all part of Jesse's plan. If he had just asked to leave, his grandfather would never have agreed. Even with another grandson, one born out of wedlock was not ideal. The old man wanted to continue his lineage to keep the vultures in the family at bay, not out of any real affection. He had intended to use Helen to control Jesse, to make him live according to his design. But Helen had clearly failed. The old man no longer needed her. His anger was just an excuse to replace her. Jesse's gaze drifted to a mother and son standing in the crowd. Their faces were alight with unrestrained joy. They thought this was their ticket to becoming true aristocrats. In reality, all that awaited them was hell. Back at his new apartment, he was sitting on the sofa, contemplating how to approach Caleb, when there was a knock on the door. It must be the food delivery. He texted the driver to leave it outside, but the knocking persisted. He got up to open the door. The next second, he was grabbed by the neck and thrown violently into the room. He stumbled, falling onto the rug. A hand cushioned the back of his head before it hit the floor. A familiar voice, low and strained, spoke. "You said you'd see me tomorrow." When Jesse saw the face, his brain shut down. He couldn't believe it. The person he had thought about day and night was actually here. The solid feel of the body, the reality of the presence, told him it wasn't a dream. This was real. This was Caleb. Jesse. He wanted to say that his longing for him could fill oceans, but now that he was here, he was so clumsy he couldn't form a single word. "You need to be punished." Caleb's face had lost its boyish softness, but the obsessive focus in his brown eyes, reserved only for Jesse, remained unchanged. A kiss followed, more an act of venting than affection. Teeth clashed, and the familiar taste of blood filled his mouth. But Caleb couldn't bring himself to be truly harsh. He softened the pressure, his lips moving to Jesse's ear. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "I should have just fucked you senseless that day." Jesse turned his head, his face a picture of shock. 6 years ago, he would never have believed those words could come from Caleb's mouth. Caleb looked away, his expression unreadable. He said he had been looking for Jesse everywhere. He asked what was so terrible about him that Jesse had to run so far away. Jesse opened his mouth to explain, but Caleb cut him off by stuffing his own shirt into Jesse's mouth, giving him no chance to speak. He pulled off his belt and used it to tie Jesse's hands. He stood over him, looking down. Jesse's shock only intensified. Where the hell did this kid learn all this? Caleb began unbuttoning Jesse's shirt. He said Jesse was the one who started it, that he would belong to him forever. Even if he hated him, Caleb would tie him to his side for the rest of his life so he could never run away again. This was seriously illegal. The last person who had been this intense was now in prison thanks to him. Caleb knew every one of his sensitive spots. All Jesse could do was make muffled, useless protests. For God's sake, let him say something. This was going to kill him. It really was. This place was going to be a crime scene by morning. But damn it, why was part of him looking forward to it? "Hey guys," a male voice came from the open doorway. Caleb stopped unbuttoning Jesse's shirt and looked toward the door. Jesse craned his neck to see. No wonder he'd felt a draft. Caleb hadn't closed the door. The young man at the door looked vaguely familiar. He held up his hands. "You guys, continue. Just pretend I'm not here. Like hell." Jesse started making louder, muffled noises. Caleb grabbed a jacket from the floor and threw it over him, then stood up. His physique was flawless. How had he gotten so tall? "Who are you to Jesse?" Caleb asked, his back to him. Jesse couldn't see his expression, but his tone was more than 90% hostile. The young man at the door's eyes suddenly welled with tears. His voice cracked as he sobbed. I'm his fiancé." Jesse almost choked. Caleb turned his head, looking down at him. The look in his eyes, it was like an abandoned puppy's. Jesse shot up from the floor, untied the belt in 2 seconds, and threw the wadded-up shirt onto the ground. He told the kid that he had better start explaining right now. Jesse had been playing along this whole time just to enjoy a little bit of a fantasy. He knew Caleb was too straight-laced to ever go along with it if he asked, and a small misunderstanding could be fun, but a big one could ruin everything. The young man at the door finally realized what was happening and waved his hands frantically. He explained that he had pretended to be the fiancé at the banquet. His grandfather and Jesse's grandfather had insisted on the marriage, but his older sister was already in love with someone else, so they dressed him up as a girl and sent him instead. No wonder he looked familiar. The young man wiped his tears and continued. Not long after Jesse left, the housekeeper's son started harassing him. But then a whole squad of police officers stormed the estate. The housekeeper's son panicked, babbling that he had only touched him a little. In the end, Jesse's grandfather and that woman, Helen, were both arrested. The housekeeper and her son made a scene and were taken away for disorderly conduct and obstructing justice. He finished by saying that Jesse was incredible and asked how he did it. He wanted to be strong too, to protect his sister. Jesse sighed internally. This kid had no sense of timing. Still, anyone with half a brain could see that he was a little busy. An idea came to him. He told the kid that if he called a certain person, he could teach him. He gave him a phone number. The young man thanked him profusely and even closed the door for them on his way out. Then, Jesse retied the belt around his own wrists and lay back down on the floor. "Let's continue," he said. "And don't hold back." Caleb didn't move. "Seriously?" Jesse complained. Interruptions were one thing, but wasn't undressing him just a waste of a good shirt? They could be doing other things. Caleb's eyes darkened. He pulled Jesse up in one motion and into his arms. He asked him to tell him what happened during those 6 years. As expected of the prodigy, able to piece things together from just that short interruption. He told Caleb he would tell him everything slowly. But first, the good news. He had started a company. It was called Astra. He leaned in close and whispered it in Caleb's ear. A month later, Jesse was on top, Caleb was on the bottom. Jesse went to the prison to visit his grandfather. He remarked that he was enjoying his golden years here. He had food, drink, and people to look after him. The old man, on the other side of the glass, exploded with rage. He called Jesse insane, asking what good any of this did him. What if he got the shares and then reneged on his promises? Jesse told him he could send him to prison right then. He only had evidence of his and Helen's crimes. When they turned on each other, when he abandoned Helen and she lost faith in him, he snapped his fingers. They would confess to everything the other had done. The old man was first shocked, then burst into laughter. "Smart," he said. "A true archer." Jesse frowned slightly, then a thought occurred to him, and a smile touched his lips. He asked the old man how he could be so sure Jesse was an archer at all. The old man's expression froze. He began to cough violently, bending over. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Satisfied, Jesse stood up. Outside the prison, Caleb reached out his hand. Jesse didn't know if he was an archer, but he knew one thing. He was one of Caleb's. He belonged to Caleb. In a beachfront house, Jesse was in the middle of another battle with Caleb when his phone started ringing incessantly. It had the kind of persistence that suggested it would ring until next year if he didn't answer. He snatched it up without looking, assuming it was work. A furious roar came from the other end. "Jesse, can you please stop giving my number to random people in the future?" The man above him let out a dissatisfied grunt. You should get along with him," Jesse said into the phone. "The kid cries a lot. He's just your type." "What the hell are you doing, Jesse?" A voice shouted. "Busy." He hung up. A person with no situational awareness deserved to be with someone who also had none. A hothead and a crybaby. They were a perfect match. Just then, Caleb took his hand. "Not paying attention," he said. "You need to be punished." "No, brother," Jesse pleaded. "One more round and I'm actually going to die." Outside, the waves crashed against the shore under the bright, warm sun.